20 minutes? You told me an hour and 20 minutes.
He was going to play the rotary, but I told him
Give on. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to all of you, the new members who are coming on board to learn more about the history of the Fiestas, and then old-timers who probably, like me, need to refresh our memory about what it's all about. I'd like to begin with a story. It's a true story. It's a story of a farmer in Arkansas. Anybody know where Arkansas is? Yes. And he had inherited from his father a farm, and he tried very hard to work it, but he always had problems. Every time he went out to plow, he encountered big blue-gray rocks everywhere in the field. He would just pile them up in the corners. There were just so many of them, and the soil was very poor because of that. One day, in the middle of all this poverty, he read, this is the late 1800s, mind you, he read that there was diamond strikes in South Africa. Did you know that South Africa is one of the richest producing places for diamonds in the world? And at that time, they had found huge ores of diamond. So he said to his wife, let's sell this miserable farm with all the rocks, and let's go to South Africa, and there we'll make it rich. So he sold it to his neighbor, the farmer next door, and he just took his family lock, stock, and barrel, and they moved to South Africa. As luck would have it, he moved from diamond strike to diamond strike, always a day late and a dollar short. Whenever he got to that particular mine, it had played out, and the end of his life, he was just as penniless as he was when he left his farm. Meanwhile, back at the farm, what was happening there? His neighbor continued to try to farm that same many acres of land, but he kept on encountering the same darn blue rocks. One day, a geologist from the University of Arkansas got lost in one of those backcountry roads, and he came up in his buggy, asked for directions about how to get back on the main highway. The farmer gave it to him, and then the geologist said, "Sir, I notice you have some very strange looking rocks, those blue-gray ones." The man said, "I have piles of them. Could I take one or two to go study at the University of Arkansas geology department?" The man said, "You can take as many as you want." About a year later, the geologist came back and he said, "You know those blue-gray rocks you gave me?" "Yes," he said, "we did an assay test of it and it's diamond ore." It's true. It's the only diamond mine in the United States. Did you know that? It's in Arkansas. And so he said, all those rocks are diamond ore. And the farmer said, "I have acres and acres of those rocks." And the geologist said, "Then you have acres and acres of diamonds." Now, I like that story because we're often like that, aren't we? As human beings, we're not satisfied with the treasures we have underneath our feet, and we start looking for something else better. Whether we don't like our wife and we're going to trade her in for a new model somewhere else, or whether we don't like where we're living and we hope we're going to find nicer people somewhere else, or even if we're living in a place that we kind of find boring and we go look for the riches of somewhere else. Like, how many of us have visited Paris and Rome? Many of us have, but how many of us have visited the treasures here in New Mexico? In New Mexico, we have acres and acres of diamonds. Just to name a few, did you know that in New Mexico we have the greatest expression of Native American culture in the United States? The ruins of Chaco Canyon, built by the Anasazi, are the greatest expression of Native American culture in the United States. Did you know that? It's even been declared by the United Nations as a World Heritage Site. How many of us have ever been to Chaco Canyon? God bless you, about half. There's so many of us that haven't. Did you know that the Spanish missions of New Mexico are older by a century and a half than the ones in Texas and California? Did you know that The oldest Spanish settlement, San Gabriel, near San Juan de los Caballeros, is 9 years older than Jamestown, that just celebrated their 400th anniversary. Did you know that Santa Fe was founded 10 years before Plymouth Rock? Did you know that our santos are the only expression of native-born church religious art in the United States? Everything else borrowed from Europe. Did you know that our church missions, like the beautiful example of Cristo Rey, is the only indigenous form of church architecture in the United States? We have treasures untold, and we should be so terribly proud of them. And one of the great treasures we have is the Santa Fe Fiestas. It is the oldest communal celebration of a European kind, because our native brothers and sisters have much older celebrations than the Santa Fe Fiestas, of a European kind in the United States. And we have the oldest statue of the Blessed Mother in the United States. Did you know that? Now, what are the Santa Fe Fiestas all about? Let me give you a little bit of background. As you know, New Mexico was inhabited by Native Americans, Indian peoples who had migrated from Mongolia and Manchuria across the Bering Straits about 13,000 years ago. And they had settled these beautiful valleys and lands. These people were called Pueblo people, the descendants of the Anasazi. Now, they lived in a very tight-knit community that was revolving around the cycles of nature. It was a community in which the individual counted less than the rest of the people together. Community was essential to them. For example, no one could marry without the permission of the elders because it was essential that the marriage be good for the community. Does that make sense? It was not one built on my rights, but on the rights of all of us to survive. A very holy and spiritual civilization. Now, these people were encountered by the Spanish in 1598 under the direction of Coronel de Vázquez. He is the only real conquistador that ever came up the valley from Mexico. What do I mean by that? The conquistadores were almost all soldiers who were second-born sons. Why is that important? Because in Spain, the firstborn inherited everything. The thirdborn was given to the church to be a priest or a brother. The secondborn, he was out of luck. So he either had to work for his older brother, which was a despicable sort of thing, or to find employment in the army or some kind of adventure. So most of Coronado's 600 soldiers were second-born sons, and they came up for three things. It has often been said the Spanish come for three things. So you're going to be quizzed on this, so put attention, write it down. They came for glory, gold, and God. Okay, glory, gold, and God. They were second-born sons. They wanted to make a name for themselves in some great adventure, be named a capitán or an hidalgo. You know what hidalgo means? Hijo de alguien. You're going to become someone important, go back and by your own manner in Spain, become a nobleman. They came looking for gold. Why would they be looking for gold? Well, in Mexico City and in the Incan Empire, they found incredible amounts of gold. The Aztecs and the Incans had mined it, and it was an incredible treasure there. So they fully expected that when they received reports of the 7 cities of gold to the north, that if anything as fabulous as Mexico City could be discovered, they would discover it up here too. The impossible was very possible for them. The incredible was within reach. So they came looking for gold. And they came also for God. They had been given the direction by the King of Spain to spread the Catholic faith that they had died for by throwing out the Muslims out of Spain. Okay? So they came up here for three things. They didn't find any glory. And they didn't find any gold. Did you know the Spanish, the only place they ever found any gold in New Mexico is the Ortiz Mountains, near Cerrillos and Galisteo. Later on, the Americans found some gold in the White Oaks area in southern New Mexico. But New Mexico never produced any wealth. The only reason they decided to stay is because Coronado, this is the way he described New Mexico when he wrote back to the king. He said, "This miserable kingdom is not worth any further effort on behalf of your majesty, except for the fact there are 30,000 Indian souls that should be given Christianity." Now, this is a very remarkable difference in the Spanish way of looking at the Indians than, let's say, the English. The Spanish, when they encountered the Indians, for all their faults, and they had many, we'll go into that, they thought that they had souls. Now, that sounds funny, doesn't it? But if we would have landed on the moon and found little green people with 3 eyes, would we not have had the same question? Are they human? Do they have a soul? Should we preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to them? And so they had a big old theological debate in Spain at the University of Salamanca, and they decided that yes, the Indians had souls, they should be preached to and given the gospel, and they should have rights under Spanish law. Unfortunately, the Spanish regarded them as children. You know, they're children, and we've been given the guardianship over them. However paternalistic that was and condescending that was a heck of a lot better than the English on the East Coast. If you doubt me, ask yourself where the great tribes on the East Coast are now. The Susquehannocks, the Iroquois, the Nanticokes, all of them wiped out by the English policy of moving them out or wiping them out. The English regarded the Indians not as human, but subhuman. Subhuman. I'll never forget Herman Agoyo of San Juan Pueblo Okeawinge saying to me once, "You know, the Spanish treated us bad, but I'm happy they found us before the English did." And it's true, because the English would have been much worse taskmasters, not to say that the Spanish weren't. Now, the Spanish came up, and in 1598, they sent the governor, Don Juan de Oñate, with 8 priests to bring the faith to the Indians, and 120 soldiers and their families to protect the little colony. So New Mexico was established first and foremost as an outreach to bring Christianity to the Indians, whether they wanted it or not. The Spanish thought they had an obligation under God to spread the faith to all people, as Christ said, making disciples of all nations. Now, the first governor of New Mexico, Don Juan de Oñate, how can we describe him? An SOB would be a good way of describing him. He was awful to the Indians and to the Spanish colonists that came with him. He was a harsh man. He was a wealthy man who had bought the rights to become New Mexico's first governor. And so he felt he had a right to come in here, look for gold and silver, and try to make back the money he had spent to buy the governorship. He treated the Indians very badly, and perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of that, but not the only one, was the taking of Acoma Pueblo, and because they had revolted against his rule and killed his nephew. And the Spanish, with a small force, took Acoma, which had not been taken in 700 years, and they brought the women and children to Santo Domingo to be tried. And according to the records, the verdict was guilty for revolting against the Spanish crown, and the men had to have their right foot cut off, and the women sold into slavery. Now, as bad as that was, he was just as bad to the Spanish. Any Spanish settler that opposed him lost his head, literally, would be beheaded. He was such a disgrace to the Spanish crown that he was called back to Mexico City and fined $7 million for the maladministration of New Mexico. he appealed to the King of Spain and went to Madrid to reverse the decision, and the king refused to meet him, calling him a despicable figure. That's our first governor. Some people say they haven't gotten any better since then. So he was fined for his mistreatment of the Indians and fined for his mistreatment of the Spanish colonists. Did you know that half his colonists moved back to Mexico? That's how much they hated him. They moved back to Mexico. Now, he was replaced with a long series of governors. Some of them were good, like Don Pedro Peralta, who said, let's move the Spanish village away from being near Okeawinge, which means village of the strong people, doesn't it? And he said, let's move away from there because there's a tension and stress over the food supplies, and let's move it over here to Santa Fe, which did not have any Indian pueblos, the ones here having been abandoned about 1300. So Santa Fe was moved here. It's called the Water Place because at one time, believe it or not, Santa Fe had lots of water. Marshes, did you know that? The whole area we're in here now, marshes of water. So the Spanish felt this is a great place to raise crops and to build up a community. And it was called La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Asís, the royal village of the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi. They didn't realize how harsh the winters were. Do you know how the Spanish described the weather in Santa Fe? This is what one governor wrote back. En Santa Fe hay 8 meses del invierno y 4 meses del infierno. He said in Santa Fe there's 8 months of winter and 4 months of hell. Okay? So, but they stayed. Now, what happened to the Franciscan priests? They went out to the different pueblos. And in some cases, they were very successful at bringing people to Christianity. One example was Pecos, which was the great pueblo of Sicuye. And you can tell how successful the Spanish Franciscan was in a particular pueblo by the size of the church. If there were 2,000 people in the pueblo and the church could hold 500, that gave you an idea how successful they were at bringing some people to Christianity. Most of the time, though, the Indians remained with their native faith. Now, this angered the Spanish Franciscans who tried to stamp out the native faith. This disappointed the Indians who regarded them as holy men. Now, the Franciscans didn't disappoint them any more than the Spanish governors who were all here to make money. They came here for 4 years. They were here to make some money, go back, and go back to Spain. You know how you can tell they never wanted to stay here? They never brought their wives. They never brought their children. One governor described New Mexico as remoto sin igual, remote without equal. He didn't want to stay here. His job was to come and govern on behalf of the king, make a lot of money, whether it came from the Spanish settlers or from the Indians, it did not matter, and go back. This type of oppression of the Indians from both the religious leaders and from the secular or the governors ended up disappointing and confusing the Indians. So they rose up in revolt in 1680. And one of the secret weapons they had in this is now they could all speak one language. And what language is that? Spanish. See, before the Indians, according to the different pueblos, either spoke Tiwa, Tewa, Towa, Keres, or Tompiro. Tompiro is a dead language now. I can't go into that, not enough time. But now, all the pueblos could communicate with each other somewhat with Spanish. And they said to each other, do you like these turkeys? Do you like these Spanish guys over here? And they all came to the conclusion, no. So they rose up in revolt on August the 10th, 1680, Fiesta de San Lorenzo. And they had an ingenious way of communicating with one another with knots on a rope that would be sent from one pueblo to the other. The Spanish governor got wind of it. His name was Otermin. And he started calling the settlers back from the far-flung haciendas back to Santa Fe. It was too late. The revolt spread all across the different pueblos, and they rose up against their Spanish rulers. There was much bloodshed. Terrible things were done on both sides. Churches were burned, priests were murdered, women and children killed on both sides. And the last holdout in the north was Santa Fe. And 1,000 settlers came in from the northern areas like Santa Cruz and Taos, and they flooded into Santa Fe and in the walls of the Palace of the Governors. The Palace of the Governors was much bigger than it is now. It went all the way to almost Paseo de Peralta. It was a very big compound, with walls and towers. And there the Indians laid siege to them. 5,000 Indian warriors laid siege to them. It was a very bitterly fought battle over Santa Fe. And the whole community was being burned around the Palace of the Governors when the priest ran into the church to bring out the Blessed Sacrament. Why? So that it would not be desecrated. He consumed the Blessed Sacrament. And one lady by the name of Josefa Zambrano, she was the sacristana, ran in and rescued the statue of our Blessed Mother. And after that particular battle, the Spanish decided, let's leave. And the Indians let them go. And it is said that as they carried the statue of the Virgin Mother, tears came down her eyes for what her children, both the Spanish and the Indians, had done to each other. Now, the Spanish went to El Paso. I always like to tell the Texans that their first and oldest community was founded by New Mexicans. And they fled to El Paso. And there they waited until the King of Spain decided what to do. Madrid was very far away, so it took much time to think about what to do with his northern colony. In the meantime, what had happened to the Indians in the north? They had been led by a very brilliant leader, Pope from Taos. But after he established the kicking out of the Spanish, by the way, the revolt of 1680 was the only time in which the Indians in the United States won a major war against a European power. That's another instance in New Mexico history that's a first. The Indians won many battles against the U.S. Army, for example, but they didn't win the wars because the U.S. Army, wore them out. But in New Mexico, the Indians defeated a European power. They were willing to put off and shake off the oppression. Now, under Pope, that was his doing. He was a brilliant leader. Unfortunately, after the Spanish left, he ended up kind of being a little dictatorial, and he was pushed off by the rest of the Indians they didn't want him to be their leader. He was leader good enough for the revolt, but not for what happened afterwards. Then the Indian pueblos started fighting among themselves, and they became divided, and unfortunately they became prey to the Navajos and to my own relatives, the Apaches. Okay? So actually, did you know for a fact that during that 12-year period, at least once or twice, the Indians sent delegations down to El Paso saying, come back. You may have to change your way of life, but come back. And another thing that's not very well known is that some of the pueblos had gone down with the Spanish. Did you know that? The pueblo of Isleta and the pueblo of Socorro, when the Spanish went down to El Paso, they went with them. Because it was not that black and white. Some Indians really liked the Spanish. Some Indians had become very, very Catholic, and they went down with the Spanish. And to this day, did you know there are two pueblos in El Paso? One called Socorro del Sur, and the other one called Isleta del Sur. So some of the Indians said, come back, help us, because we're struggling against the Apaches. Come back, we want you changed, but we